Episode 81, Ketchup, the 18th century name for umami. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week I'll be looking at the colonial excitement over tastiness, which means I'll have to explain umami and how every food culture craves some form of something a little bit decayed to give their food a little bit of savoriness that can't be got any other way. If you think I'm making this up, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that umami is just the latest name for a taste sensation that people have been striving to describe pretty much since people started describing food to each other. It was only at the start of the 20th century that we pinned it to a particular chemical, glutamic acid or glutamate, two forms of more or less the same molecule. There are a couple of other associated nucleotides as well, but I'm not going to go that deep here. It wasn't until the 1980s when tongue biology and taste science, yes, those are real, developed enough to confirm that umami, or savoriness, is an essential chemical taste, just like sweet, sour, bitter, and salty. Oh, and while I'm at it, those tongue maps are complete bunk. Play around with some toothpicks and honey, lemon juice, and salt, and maybe some bitters, and you'll see that I'm right. Now, before you get all worried about this glutamate chemical, calm down. Glutamate is just an amino acid, something that is in everything that has cells, so it's already in all the living stuff on Earth. It's just that there are some living things that have more of it, and there are ways to concentrate it and make it more accessible, and humans have been doing that for a very long time. Which means, oh boy, it looks like another bonus chemistry episode coming up for all of us. This time on proteins and amino acids and what MSG or monosodium glutamate is. That's where I'll go all biochemistry on you. But for this episode, I'll simply explain that proteins, which have a role in the healthy functioning of bodies, are put together out of little pieces called amino acids. For whatever reason, the glutamic acid or glutamate amino acid, that's the one that tastes good to us. So in a similar way, we crave the sweet flavor of sugar-containing things which grant us carbohydrate energy. We also seek protein because we need it to keep our bodies from literally falling apart. Proteins are also handy when we're growing up to our full size for actually building our bodies as we grow up. And foods with high concentrations of protein often also have plenty of glutamate. In another convergence of circumstances, several of the methods we use to preserve protein-containing foods actually enhances our ability to get at free glutamate. We can't taste it when it's all tied up in a protein, but when proteins are broken down into their separate amino acid pieces, that's when we can taste it. There are quite a few non-meat foods out there that have this amino acid in abundance, and they also end up as popular flavor enhancers in just about every food culture out there. But I'm not here to talk about all the food cultures, just the American one. Well, mostly. Because of that, it's time to look at the colonial and soon American love of ketchup. This episode will look back at where it came from and how it developed into its 18th century colonial self, talk about the different flavors, and finally explain why tomato was not a possible option in the 18th century. I'll also wrap things up with a few pointers on where and how you can try things that probably taste something like the non-tomato ketchups of the 18th century and what they're good for. And since you've been listening this long, you know what comes first. Some history. What becomes ketchup started out all tied up in the liquid that is collected from strategically rotted fish. Ew, you might say, but let me explain. Back in the before the Common Era, before the designated 0 year, so the BCE days, food required much more individual human effort to obtain. That means the idea of waste not, want not was taken far more seriously than it is now. To that end, even tiny bony fish that are not particularly fun to eat and the guts from larger fish were regarded as food, or at least the components of food, and were not just thrown away, especially in places with larger societies with more people to feed and enough people to allow for specialization and trade. Oh, and two other things were necessary: stable locations and lots lots, and I mean lots and lots, of salt, because in order to make fish sauce, the fish needed to sit in a place for months undisturbed, and you needed to put them in lots and lots of salt. So, versions of fish sauce and fermented fish have developed just about everywhere there was a saltwater fishing culture and some sort of permanent village or town. Evidence of the use of salt fermented fish is present in South America, Southern Europe, North Africa, West Africa, and East Africa, especially around the Red Sea, where there is an astounding amount of evaporated salt. In societies all around the edge of the Indian Ocean and along the Pacific coast of East Asia. There are also traditions close to the Arctic Circle that ferment fish in the cold without salt, but that makes something entirely different and not what we're talking about here. In older, well-preserved, and widely available written food traditions, there are two notable styles of fermented fish products. First, there is the East Asian style that started probably as a ferment of soybeans and fish, and then later developed into bean-only ferments and fish-only ferments. The best-known bean ferments continue on as the Chinese dochur and the Japanese natto and miso. The best-known fish ferments show up as fish sauce, and there are as many versions of that as there are food cultures in East Asia. There are also fish cheeses and fish pastes as well. Shrimp paste can be found pretty easily as a flavor booster in East Asian markets. It is worth noting that these ferments were made primarily with small bony fish, many of which are not particularly satisfying to eat as fish. But their protein and flavor was made accessible, storable, and portable by converting them into sauce. Modern, pricey, fancy, high-quality fish sauces will use specific fish like anchovies, but a lot of fish sauce that has been made in history was likely made out of tiny fish you've never heard of. The second well-known fish ferment is the Mediterranean style, known as the ancient Greek charos, Roman garum or liquamen, and the modern Sicilian colatura. The ancient stuff was typically a way of converting scraps in the innards of Mediterranean tuna to something useful. As the tuna disappeared due to ancient overfishing, mackerel became the popular fish sauce fish. The modern colatura uses anchovies. And generally, it seems like oily fish seem to be the key to successful fish sauce, regardless of the style. Oh, and you have to include parts of the digestive tract, because without that, the enzymes needed to break down the fish, release the glutamate and the other amino acids, they aren't there. So never let anyone tell you their fish sauce is made only with fillets or something. It literally cannot work that way. In Europe, as the Roman trade network collapsed in the first centuries of the Common Era, the garum trade contracted, and most of Europe lost access to and awareness of fish sauce. And then the European age of exploration happened. The race for spices to flavor food at more affordable prices also led to people being trapped on boats with barrels of terrible food for longer and longer periods of time. Not surprisingly, shelf-stable condiments of savory flavors became popular items among sailors. Vinegars, pepper sauces, and other things that could stand up to the sloshing and the wild temperature fluctuations and the constant damp of sea travel were welcome additions to weevily biscuits, grain and dried pea mushes, maggoty cheese, and barreled salt meat of questionable provenance. Tubers of different types, coconuts, and other vegetable matter that would store for a little bit was added to their diets, but as anyone who has eaten root vegetables know, they benefit greatly from seasoning. How many people dig in enthusiastically to a plain, unsalted baked potato? And so, these mystery fish sauces, some with only fish and salt, but other with oysters or fruits, vegetables, and spices, became popular shipboard condiments. Now there's the name. Ketchup with a K or catsup with a C. These and other wide varieties of spelling show that this word was transliterated, that is, taken from one language system that uses completely different sounds and writing systems and smooshed into a new one. And because ketchup is the Englishified version of a word taken up by polyglot European sailors, English, French, Dutch, just to name a few, it is hard to pin down what the word used to be. But based on where the word ketchup first shows up in English ship captains' inventories, in the 1690s no less, the southern coast of China, the same place European sailors were seeking tea, porcelain, and cloth. The Hokkien dialect origin of the name seems to make the most sense. After all, the end part chup meant sauce. And this is the area where European sailors were picking up their cargo, so why not their condiments? By the very start of the 18th century, the British merchant Charles Lockyer was even sharing his opinion that the best ketchup was to be got in Tonkin, or what most people know as Tonkin, a part of northern Vietnam that was under Chinese control at the time. By 1727, Eliza Smith includes a recipe for English ketchup with an O in her Complete Housewife cookbook. The recipe leans heavily on vinegar, wine, and anchovies, while also including lemon peel and a long list of spices. To revisit last week's theme for a second, she also has a recipe for how to make melon mangoes and one for cucumber mangoes as well. It will be common to have ketchups of mushrooms, oysters, walnuts, and even lemons alongside the anchovy one. In the colonies, mushroom ketchup becomes popular as anchovies are typically imported. But just about anyone can go out and find mushrooms, even if people kind of look down upon foraging. I mean, come on guys, mushrooms. And I bet you will end up not surprised that mushrooms, oysters, and walnuts are foods that rank high on the glutamate charts. The pickling and preserving procedures used in making these ketchups, simmering in wine, ale, or vinegars, and then letting them sit in the acidic liquids, breaks down the proteins of these different foods and releases the glutamate for our taste buds. The flavors of this vinegared anchovy ketchup is going to be quite different from this salt-digested anchovy-based fish sauce it was based on. But both versions definitely bring a savoriness that was absent from both the shipboard and open hearth cauldron-based boil and simmer cookery that grew out of the English cooking traditions. What mattered to the people making the ketchups was that they made all sorts of food taste better, and due to the high acid content, they kept. Stoppered up in a bottle or barrel, ketchup stayed good for a long time. It was a flavoring in itself and worked in concert with the other essential flavoring agent of the age, salt. Now in our modern lives where we have deliciously spiced foods with bottles and jars and boxes of spices at our fingertips, it is easy to forget how lots of people experience 18th century food and the world. Fortunately, I was reminded of how lots of colonial food was cooked in a funny way. Something on social media caught my eye, and it was somebody sharing about a nice, easy dinner they were making as part of a self-directed diet regimen. It was plain oatmeal, a boiled egg, and a boiled chicken breast, no salt for what it's worth, and topped with a chopped up green onion. Now, I have thoughts, but the important one for our purposes here is that this is a reasonable depiction of 18th century colonial cooking. I mean, an egg and a piece of meat the size of an entire modern chicken breast would have been protein for several people, and it would have been served with much, much, much more cooked grain. But the complete lack of seasoning in the cooking process wouldn't have been that weird. Yes, I know the contemporary cookbooks talk about making up different broths and ragouts for the cooking of meats and vegetables, but these are cookbooks for well-off people, not what most of the people were doing. I mean, I just think about, say, the 4 to 8 ingredients I might put into a broth to use it for cooking stuff. Most were not typical in the 18th century North American British colonies. Some items would have only been rare, but some would have been completely unavailable. Salt for starters. That seems easy, and it would have been around, but it could be expensive or a lot of effort. Black pepper or chili pepper flakes, these were usually not an option for a regular person in the northern colonies. A bay leaf, maybe or maybe not. They grew around the Mediterranean, so would have been a completely reasonable import into England, but they would have been a dear one in the colonies. Though a Caribbean variety would soon enter the young American pantry. Bay leaves don't become inexpensive until the country makes it to California and finds a West Coast version growing wild. Garlic? Not a chance. Garlic decidedly was not for 18th century food. It was a medicine at most, and a highly suspicious substance even then. Onion? possibly. It depends what was left in the cellar. And celery hadn't even made it into the pantry yet. It was literally invisible to the colonists. It was sort of around and labeled as a weird sort of parsley, but no one takes much note of it and seems to not use it. Now, there will be celery madness when it does get recognized and cooperative cultivars are developed. And yes, celery is also a repository of glutamate, which explains its presence in the base of so many French dishes, as part of the mirepoix, the celery, onion, carrot mixture, and as part of the gumbo trinity, onion, celery, and green pepper. So many of the things I use to throw together for a basic broth would just not have been around for the average colonial cook. And so what it comes down to, for our 18th century colonist, plain boiled, probably salted, meat served with a simmered grain and some onion and maybe another root vegetable or so is a reasonably typical meal. Boiling meat while keeping the nutrients in the pot does not really develop flavors. And this, you can see, is where ketchup would become important. While we modern people marinate, grill, spice rub, smoke, or spit roast fresh meat, we also enjoy making sauces to put on it. Unmarinated, boiled meat and grains. These were much in need of ketchup rescue. In England, much ketchup was made and eaten there as well. With the closer tie to India and more spices and chemists available for messing about, all manner of other seasoned vinegar and brown type sauces were invented, and would coalesce upon Worcestershire sauce in the 19th century. And this is the sort of flavor, and possibly more importantly, the texture an 18th century ketchup eater was encountering. So other than the acid liquids that made up most of the ketchups and then the savory main flavors, the anchovies, oysters, walnuts, and mushrooms, what else was going into these 18th century homemade ketchups? Shallots or some other sort of onion always makes an appearance. They also have some or all of the spices from the selection of mace, ginger, cloves, and pepper or chili pepper pods, depending on your location, and often nutmeg, lemon peel, and horseradish. Later recipes for ketchups, tomato and otherwise, will retain their onion. Even modern tomato ketchup lists onion or onion powder as an ingredient separate from the other spices and natural flavorings. And they will keep that mixture of warm spices like mace, ginger, and pepper, or add to them or replace them. Allspice and cinnamon in place of nutmeg and ginger, and the possible substitute of mustard for the horseradish. But the vinegar base will stay, though exactly what kind of vinegar will change and then change again as different vinegar supplies appear. It is this long list of imported spices that will keep ketchup both popular, but also a pretty fancy condiment for a while yet. Where ketchup is too dear, vinegar pickles of all sorts will bring flavor and even some color to the table of most average families of the colonies. And even where ketchup was readily available, at this point it was more likely to be an ingredient in a sauce that would come out to the table with the food than to be simply a sauce used alone. Ketchup would be used to augment an egg yolk or butter-based sauce. It would go into the gravy made from meat juices to augment a ragu. It was quite close to its fish sauce roots at this point in time as a concentrated flavor that would be added to boost the flavor of something else made with several ingredients and not just as a sauce on its own. So even though tomatoes brought ketchup to my mind, the tomato and the sauce have yet to meet. For the most part, the people in control of the spices, those deciding what they go into, are not the same people as the ones in contact with tomatoes. For such things as tomato rice and tomato pickles and tomato pie will have to be around for a while before tomatoes can be mixed up with the spices of the ketchup jar. So what that really means for us is there is no tomato ketchup until after the War of 1812, at least. But now, if you're curious and you want to try out these mysterious ketchups of the past, what can you do? The most time-consuming yet also authentic way is to make some yourself. You can follow an 18th or 19th century recipe on your own. But I wouldn't recommend that as the way to go on the first try unless you've been making your own pickled goods or beer or cider or other fermented beverages already. If you've been doing that, the techniques glancingly mentioned in these early recipes will feel familiar. Hannah Glass and Eliza Smith each have a recipe. However, for those curious people out there with less experience, The Townsend's YouTube channel has a whole video on making your own mushroom ketchup, and I'll include links to that in the show description. But how about if all you want to do is just pick something up somewhere? Worcestershire sauce is your best bet to get all the spices. However, there are intriguing things to be found at a large Chinese or Korean grocery store. In the Seattle area, I have an embarrassing number of options. If you're not in an area with East Asian grocery stores to be found on several corners, there are no lack of online sources. So the things to look for are the mushroom soy sauces and oyster soy sauces, which is different from oyster sauce. That more belongs with the late 19th century style of ketchup. And we'll get there. Miso is another reasonable source of fermentation-released glutamate and a very different consistency, but nice and stable, and another quick way to add that hard-to-describe savoriness. But it's not just East Asian sauces. There's the Costa Rican salsa Lizano. There's English HP sauce, Maggi seasoning, Marmite, Vegemite, Kitchen Bouquet, Gravy Master, Bragg liquid aminos, Knorr liquid seasoning. The list goes on. And what each and every one of these products has in common, other than being some version of brown to very dark brown, is that they contain a protein source that has been busted up and turned into amino acids. Spices and other flavorings are added to give each one their very own sweet or salty or spicy twist, but they all ride on the interaction with those sites in your tongue that are waiting for the glutamate to show up. Were any of these things that I just mentioned around in the 18th century? Other than the East Asian sauces? No. But they are doing the same job now as many of the ketchups were then. And you don't have to make them. You can just go get them. And like their 18th century counterparts, they have very concentrated flavor. So when they're eaten alone, you get a somewhat unpleasant but hard to describe flavor. But if combined with other savory foods, they make things vastly more pleasant, but still contribute a flavor that is extremely hard to describe. Some good ways to try out these flavors is by adding a little bit into something savory that you already enjoy. Some low-effort options are stirring some into a jarred tomato sauce or a soup that you're making. Not much, and the fun bit is you can add it at the end. If you're making cooked grains, rice, barley, grits, polenta, any sort of savory porridge, adding a little bit of one of these seasonings into the water when you cook the grain will add a rich flavor. Similar to, but admittedly not the same as, if you'd cook them in broth. And because meat importing laws are so draconian, all these modern versions are based on hydrolyzed, that is, broken up with water, vegetable proteins. And that means they all work even if you're going at things from a no-meat angle. So back there in the 18th century, using ketchup was the first North American flirtation with fish sauce. We forget about it, mostly because tomato ketchup has completely taken over by the end of the 19th century. And when we get to that, I'll explain how it all happens. And when America forgets about fish sauce, it will be just like Europe. There will still be pockets of anchovy sauce and anchovy paste, but it'll be mostly limited to, according to mainstream North American food thinking, some foreign weirdos, and this time not Protestant weirdos. After all this time spent with old-timey, strange, liquidy ketchup with no sugar, it's time to look at one of the most popular places for sugar to go, and that's into coffee. The products of the Caribbean and the labor of enslaved Africans brought there is really starting to feed into the growing North American colonial economy. No one looking at the markets at the start of the century saw what was coming by the end. But the accumulation of new wealth and the concentration of the market for these new luxuries was happening at a speed unknown to the world's economies. This is going to make things change in ways nobody living in the 18th century could have really seen coming. Thanks for listening. There will be links to images of a bunch of the products I mentioned in the show description. They aren't affiliate links or anything, just faster than waiting for me to get caught up with the show blog. I also did a special episode on just fish sauce if you're interested with Unchefed, and there'll be a link to that and Gastropod's look at fish sauce in the show description if you want to know more about that. Any email questions or quibbles, along with those cool book recommendations, will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Thanks to those of you who have been leaving me reviews. Some are kind of hard to find based on the way the podcast world is all fractured, but when I do run across them, they are a wonderful surprise. Show notes for this episode will at some point be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. But I did get my bibliography up. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes and other ways to send me questions are also in the show's Twitter, Insta, and Post.News bios at THOA Food and in the show description.